The digital transition. The Digital Transition, a podcast series created to assist those tasked with implementing digital strategies, where we will share our knowledge and experiences to support you in your transition.
Welcome to the Digital Transition, podcast number 17. I'm your host, Nathan Hildebrandt, and today I'm talking with Tim Mumford. Tim Mumford is a Senior Project Manager within the Department of Treasury and Finance in the Victorian Government. He's been involved in the development of the Victorian Digital Asset Strategy, or VDAS as it's called by acronym. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today, Tim.
Thanks for having me.
So for the listeners that aren't aware of who you are, and you have, and one thing that I can say is much like the Queensland Government's approach, I'm very excited to see the opportunity for yourself and Colette to have gone out to conferences around Australia and also Melbourne to present on this document. Can you just share us a little bit about yourself for the people who haven't attended those events?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an engineer by trade, an electrical engineer by trade. I also got an MBA. I cut my teeth in the asset management community down at the power station. And then I joined oil and gas, so was overseas for quite some time, working on rigs and doing some really high profile projects there. And then came back to Australia and then did some consulting in projects. So I was doing a lot of work for some big private investment players, and then came and joined the Victorian Government, worked in the Office of Projects Victoria, and now I work under Dr. Colette Burke, who's the Victorian Chief Engineer. And we're very passionate about making changes and supporting the engineering community and things that they can do to make a difference to the lives of Victorians every day.
Well, that's a very important point. And you almost might have answered my next question straight out of that one last sentence, but why was the Victorian Digital Asset Strategy created?
The VDAS was created to drive towards collaboration. It's value for Victorians. That's the end goal for all of us, to create measurable value on our capital works and digital assets. It's consistency in the way that we define, operate, manage our assets moving forward. It's just best practice. It's moving towards international best practices, both in terms of asset management as well as digital engineering, the ways that we get to there. And I think at the end of the day, public servants such as myself should be driving towards better outcomes for Victorians and the end user for our infrastructure assets. No,
it's important to understand that, and I think that's something that most taxpayers would greatly value when they understand the complexity of what this actually 100%. Is. For those that haven't had the chance to read the document yet, it's reasonably comprehensive and reasonably detailed. And, you know, there's a comparison of documents, I guess you could say. You've got a Queensland document that's 5 pages. And this document here, which is, I think, sitting at about 63, I think, from memory. It's been a while since I've looked at it. Can you just describe for the listeners that haven't had a chance to read this document yet, talk about, I guess, the priorities of the strategy and the goals in and around that area?
The VDAS strategic framework is the first of the series of VDAS, and it narrows down what DE or digital engineering and BIM could be for the state. I guess one of the challenges of building information modelling, or BIM, is the fact that it's such a broad church, it's such a broad topic, and it touches literally everything that we do when we're creating an asset. And so the VDAS strategic framework aims to narrow some of that scope down to the things that are important within the policy framework of Victoria. The vision of VDAS is to create and enhance digital assets that inform the physical delivery throughout the asset life cycle. And the last point there is really important. People such as myself, engineers, typically involved in the creation of an asset, we might be on a project for, say, 5 years. And by the time that project's completed at mechanical completion, we have to operate that asset as a state for the next 50 years. And so the focus should be on how we operate that asset, how we use that asset, how Victorians use that asset. And if we haven't got that first and foremost in any policy we write in terms of assets, I think we've missed the mark.
So it's providing, I guess, essentially a direction for industry, so there's certainty for them as well.
Precisely. Yeah, it's a confidence to industry that's also moved in the right direction. And a lot of industry has, from the fabricator level right down the supply chain, all the way up to constructors and head contractors with the state, are making moves in both digital engineering and BIM. And we want to give them a vote of confidence that this is the way forward. And this is something that the Victorian Government is very interested in pursuing.
It's certainly important. So the strategic framework document that was released in February of this year is obviously the first of a series of outputs. And obviously, I've been aware through a Building Smart calendar that I saw at an event last week up in Brisbane that you're very close to actually releasing one of your first guidance documents. Can you advise, I guess, for those that haven't read the document, a little bit about this suite of guidance documents that you plan to release? And obviously within government, things aren't guaranteed in terms of dates, but I guess a time frame, that people may expect to see these documents.
Yeah, no problems at all. So the VDAS guidance itself is the more comprehensive version. It's the revision up of essentially the strategic framework. And that's due to be released by the end of the year. And that really goes into the who, the why, the when across the asset lifecycle. It's broken up into three main phases or parts. The first part is around that sort of strategic level. And that's aimed at sort of CEO, executive levels, secretaries, deputy secretaries, and aimed towards giving them the tools and the processes and highlighting the policies that are most relevant in the digital engineering and BIM space, and highlighting where BIM and DE and VDAS itself can support them in their roles. The goal for the end of that section is really to say, why haven't we been doing this earlier? Part B is really aimed at that asset manager, facility manager. And it's my belief that the projects themselves, individual projects, aren't an island. They're part of a portfolio. The asset manager, the facility manager, that sort of central repository for where projects ebb and flow from, has a big role to play and needs to be supported in terms of VDAS, in terms of standards and common data environments and innovation around that space. The third part is around how you actually approach a project with VDAS and BIM in mind in the Victorian context. So it steps through the phases of the project itself and highlights the key components of, say, 19650 or 55000 or any of the other best practices or norms within the industry that can make a big difference to the back end of the project, and handing back to that sort of FM, AM role at the end of the project and making a difference to Victorians.
Now, that's a really important point I think you made in the middle of what you were just talking about then, and it's also, I think, the key thing as a strategy with all of this is that the government wants to achieve consistency, and consistency obviously should drive economies.
Yep.
And consistency should also mean an ease in being able to maintain or manage these assets or being able to find the information by approaching it as a whole of government approach rather than individual projects, and essentially creating kind of, almost, it might end up becoming, kind of a crazy idea similar to that of virtual Australia, New Zealand, but then you're creating a digital asset for Victorians that they get substantial value.
Yeah, that's right.
So within that, I guess you talked about the guides themselves.
The VDAS technical guides will be released throughout 2020 and 2021, and they're aimed at really subject niche topics that are aimed towards, say, 4D or 5D or asset management.
So essentially these technical guides will focus on a particular deliverable or BIM purpose in response to, a business case to reduce risk, or a business case where it's been identified that could reduce risk through saving, or saving money or identifying efficiencies. Is that really kind of, I guess, the approach of these guides? It's a suite of documents to inform industry as to how they're performed. And then on the flip side as well, it's also for your team of project managers internally here, in terms of your internal stakeholders, for them to understand how to communicate or how the industry will be responding and providing that value.
So the VDAS technical guides are aimed at specific niche topics that deserve attention in their own right, and they may not fall under the purview of the VDAS guidance as a master document. So that may include stuff like cost integration or schedule integration or risk integration or visualization, landscaping, things like that. And the idea for those is to really lean on guidance as well as input from industry. And so if you are a bit of an expert in one of those niche areas, say GIS to BIM integration, then we're really keen to hear from you on what best practice looks like in the Victorian context.
So it's a collaborative approach where integrating best practice from industry, and I highly encourage people to come and have a chat to Tim. He's highly approachable. Even let me come and have a chat to him. But at the same time, it's also the expertise within government. So it's a collaborative approach to build an outcome that is for the betterment of the Victorian people.
Yeah, very much so. It's to be a source of conversation. It's not mandated, but if I had these kind of tools when I was a project manager, I think I would have appreciated someone having walked down this path before, and I can learn from that rather than reinventing the wheel every time we do it.
Yeah, and that then lines again with the comments you made about all projects being delivered consistently rather than having this constant reinventing of the wheel.
100%.
So moving on from the technical guides, another important part of the strategic framework is a section regarding the competency framework.
Yeah.
So competency is a huge requirement for any of these approaches or guidance documents or strategies to work. Can you highlight, I guess, the concepts of the competency framework and what you're trying to achieve with that?
Yeah, sure. So the value of the competency framework is to give confidence around what are the skills, what are the traits, what are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and how do we empower our individuals on both an industry side as well as a Victorian Government side to make a difference in terms of VDAS implementation. So the competency framework should be around 2020.
Yep.
We'll be leaning on stakeholders such as the Australian BIM Academics Forum to assist with technical syllabus definition, as well as some good legacy work that has occurred through ACIF and the APCC with the BIM creds with BSA as well. So it's really aimed at the Victorian Government side on awareness of BIM and VDAS, how to have the right conversations, how to foster the right environment so that industry can do what industry does best in terms of BIM and digital engineering.
It's a tough ask, I think, for industry to accept this and move forward. But the more and more I think about it, it's actually quite simple. And it's all the actual technical knowledge or the learning isn't actually going to be the hard part. It's actually the hardest part will actually be getting over that change.
Yep.
And I guess moving on, there's also a component within the strategic framework in regards to education.
Yep. And
I also know, being up in Queensland, that trying to get university courses to adopt new syllabus is very, very challenging. And trying to get that to move forward takes a number of years. And I think one of the exciting things I think I've seen down here in Victoria now is the access to TAFE courses that the government, I think, has made free for professionals, I believe, to actually take on greater education and improve the construction industry, which I think should be applauded. It's outside of the scope of our conversation, but it should be mentioned. But what is covered within the strategic framework with regards to the education map?
At a basic level, the education map is just a summary of what are the education providers doing within Victoria with respect to DE and BIM. And it allows Victorians, professionals, non-professionals to essentially get a good idea of what's out there, what the potential price is, what the expected learning outcomes, and how that best improve their outcomes moving forward. You mentioned free courses. Yeah, I also applaud the Victorian Government on this. They have a big commitment towards free TAFE and TAFE learning outcomes as a pathway. BIM is one of them. I guess one of the challenges that the education industry faces, and this is something that ABAF are working on, is individuals' learning outcomes when they need to be a professional. And I think one of the challenges of BIM is that you almost need a degree of knowledge in the construction and engineering and architectural and project space, a base level of knowledge before you actually apply some of the concepts of 19650 and VDAS. You could read 19650 and you could read 1192, or you could read any of these things and you could think you have the workflows that happen in the real world, but it doesn't happen like that.
Yes.
And so it's pretty important to understand, I think, the way that the industry works and the siloedness of it and the players and what their incentives are, and then put that in the context of best practice around 19650 and VDAS and the Victorian context in policies and frameworks and acts, and apply that in a pragmatic sense. That presents itself as a real challenge for the education industry. How do you attract some of that talent back in a meaningful way where they're not giving up their day jobs for a long period of time? And so I think the education community, in terms of upskilling the professional engineering and architectural and construction community, is going to be a challenging one over the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, well, I did a presentation or a lecture the other week for a QUT BIM club up in Queensland. And I was just talking about the concepts of BIM, and it was quite interesting what you were just saying then. And because one of the key things that I think that BIM does bring out is it does bring out the weakness in the knowledge of people, because in the past you only had to resolve the pieces that you drew, for example, if you're a designer. And now the design professionals are actually having to create virtual models of what is going to be built. So there's nowhere to hide.
Yeah.
So the fundamentals for the, and I'll use this term in this instance, but the architect of the future, and this could be the same for engineers or anything of the like, or any tradesperson. First of all, to be successful in your career, you need to actually be good at your professional craft. So that can't be forgotten, which is essentially the first step you talked about. The next step, I believe, is actually have skills in actually understanding the tools. So in the past, it was a pen and pencils and set squares and all those sorts of things. And now it's software tools. And then the third component is that once you understand both of those items, it's understanding the processes. You know, you take that to a stonemason. You know, in the past, they would have done it by chisel. Now, these days, majority of the stone might be cut using mechanical saws and stuff like that to make it easier. But you have to understand the basics of how the process works, of how the thing goes together in a safe manner to enable it to work. So it's going to be a piece-by-piece approach to achieving these great outcomes. But I think we both know that the benefits will kind of essentially work out.
Yeah, I think you're dead right, Nathan. I think with the respect to those three things that you mentioned, the first one is something that should never go away, and that's something that that each individual stakeholder to the development of a project or an asset brings, and that should never be forgotten. The third one that you mentioned, I think, is particularly poignant because this is almost the source of truth. This is the thing that's not going to change over a period of time. So I think there's a real value in having that individual understands what the greater purpose is, and who is downstream and upstream from them. Because I think the context of that first element, their professional skill, will become a lot more relevant in that reality. Whereas the second element, which you talked about, the tools and the software, it's probably important to note that I think that BIM and DE is about 10% about software and tools. And I think that should be reflected in the education. You know, in 2 years' time, it may be a completely different landscape in the way that information is generated. It's just a tool.
Yes, they're always changing and evolving, so you can't rely on that 100%. One thing alone.
You don't define, say, a chippy by his nail gun. You define a chippy by his vision and able to interpret clients' needs and wants into a functional outcome. And the same should apply to anyone driving or using BIM.
I like how I get distracted and go off on track on these sorts of things. It's good fun having these conversations and having these are the key poignant things that actually make this all work. You know, apart from all the kind of technical jargon, if people take a step back for a second and think about just some of these kind of abstract concepts, it actually simplifies it, makes it a little bit less of a burden. I guess because there is no mandate, there's no line in the sand. or there's no kind of project value or nominated commercial viability within the scope of this document. At this point in time, the individual agencies that are delivering the projects would refer to this document, and then depending upon their belief would suggest that they would follow this agenda at this stage.
That's correct. At this stage, the view for VDAS guidance is that, again, it will be non-mandatable, so you can continue to be BAU. But it's worth mentioning that industry en masse in general typically uses the processes and frameworks that are adopted. And so there's considerable upside in shaping how industry does that in a consistent fashion so that Victorian Government departments and agencies, as well as projects, can make the most of those activities that are already occurring. In terms of the VDAS guidance, we are highlighting a bit of a framework, a decision-making framework, which is aligned to current Victorian Government investment policy. And that is $0 to $100 million is discretionary, 100 to 250 is recommended, and anything above 250 is generally recommended as around essential. And there's an important overlay around the complexity of that project itself. So if it's got a high degree of interfaces or community engagement, then obviously the need for digital engineering and BIM only increases after that fact. But it's important to stress that it's non-mandated, but also that digital engineering, BIM and VDAS can afford departments and agencies a considerable upside.
The one sentence that you mentioned then that actually resonated more with me than anything else was, at the business case level, it's aligning with it. So it's demonstrating that the view of these processes is that they're there as an assistant to the existing processes rather than overriding them and completely changing them. So it's about demonstrating to stakeholders that these approaches they are new, but they're not revolutionary. They're just kind of a slight evolution of the way we can deliver these projects and gain better value.
Yeah, that's very true. And so where all the relevant policies stand in Victorian Government, we've made a really big effort on aligning VDAS within that framework. So whether it is the Investment Management Standard or the HVHR, the High Value, High Risk Framework, or the Financial Management Act, or the Asset Management Accountability Framework, we've made a really big effort to align ourselves with all of those things and make sure that this has been seamless from a commercial and procurement point as much as it is about a technical and delivery sort of point of view.
So now I like to get into the more technical side of things again. And one of the things that I'm really grateful for is seeing that within the VDAS strategic framework, you've actually nominated a classification system and of Uniclass 2015. Now I'm guessing, and that's a big dangerous thing to do, but I'm guessing that might be because of the work that Simon Vaux's done up in New South Wales, and he's invested a number of years and effort and energy in making a selection of that. So essentially, the work that has been done in New South Wales and VDAS making that suggestion, I hope we'll see further agencies across and state governments across Australia nominating one classification system, because I'm hoping that all of the states then can provide feedback back to NBS in the UK, then based out of here in Melbourne, where there are gaps in the classification system rather than having everyone approach it different ways. So that's one positive. That's one of the things I think that's really great. Then second to that, obviously, it's talking about the ISO 19650 standards, which are currently obviously Part 1 and Part 2. And I guess this might be a question that actually might not be unanswered. It might be unanswerable because it is early days. It's early days, and it hasn't really jumped off yet. And because it's non-mandate, I guess it's probably another challenging question. But do you think that because of the value of 19650, you can actually scale up and down the use of that as a standard? As a client, you can choose to stipulate a whole pile of different information requirements across the delivery of the project and standards and stuff like that. Or you can basically say, I'd have the whole lot. And some uninformed clients at this stage just go, I'd like it delivered that way. Is it the intention that over time you might see that you will actually scale the use of that standard based upon the size and complexity of your projects?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In my view, 19650 is a very scalable international standard, and particularly when overlaid with 55,000 as an international standard, it's very scalable. So whether you're doing a $50 million project or a $20 million project or a $200 million project or a $4 billion project, the policies and thoughts and processes and tools that the 19650 employs are very applicable in any of these cases. And so the concepts of OIR and AIR and PIR and all these other acronyms are particularly poignant for whatever project that we're going to implement. If you look at 19650, I think a lot of original BIM users would be very surprised by the tact that 19650 has taken around. There's not one mention of a tool or a software in that. 19650 at the heart of it is the thread of information through the asset lifecycle. And I think when we distill it down, that's what we all value. That's what we should all value. And so I think it's very scalable for a $20 million project. I think it's very scalable to a $50 million project. I think it's very scalable to a $15 billion project. And I think the key tenets of what 19650 is trying to get to is that organizational level, portfolio level use of information, that all projects circle back to that. They all have a very similar or consistent way in how information is returned back to that host. And the host itself is the repository of information. And I think that's a step change in the way that we currently do things. And I think it's a step change in the way that many people and organisations do things. And I think there's considerable value if we adopt that. On Uniclass 2015, you're right, Simon Vo has done a considerable and enviable and impressive amount of work on a consistent framework in terms of asset classification and hierarchy. And so a lot of credit to Simon and his team on doing that. And the upshot of that effort was essentially there is two major standards, Omniclass and Uniclass 2015. And the latter itself was very good and very amenable and very applicable to a broad church of asset classes. I think from a Victorian government point of view, or any government's point of view, or any organisation's point of view, the value isn't essentially having a asset classification system that is so bespoke to you and your industry and your project. The value of an asset classification system is consistency and everyone doing the same thing. We're all calling the road. We're all calling the table the table.
Yes.
We're all calling the system the system. Because if one person calls that a lane versus a road or a freeway, then it's very difficult to drive towards consistency. It's all very, very difficult to search things. It's very difficult to benchmark things. It's very difficult to demonstrate value for money in the absence of everyone calling the same thing. And so Uniclass 2015 and through the NBS and Mike down here in Victoria, who represents obviously Australia, they are exceptionally amenable to a conversation. And so I suggest if you are the asset manager, you are the custodian of an asset classification system, whether it is government or non-government, I think driving towards a consistent asset classification system and hierarchy is so important. And it doesn't mean that you can give up or you do give up the way that you operate or use your current assets or your facility. If you need to manage 17 pumps below the classification system of pumps, then Uniclass allows you to do that. And if you manage to say a level 2 or a level 3 or level 1, that's your prerogative. But at some level, we all need to be calling the same thing. And so I commend also another Victorian Government initiative around the Victorian Building Information Systems. And that was a grant by the old DEGITA, Department of Economic Development, Jobs, Transport and Resources, on construction innovation. And one of them is VDAS, Victorian Building Information System, led by both AMCA and AG Coombs. And basically this is geared towards an asset classification system that is sort of agnostic. So it actually links both Omniclass and Uniclass together in the way that you would actually run a building. And so full credit to VBIS, full credit to that team and AMCA and the Victorian Government for their initiative on defining an asset classification system that's homogeneous with others, as well as thinking about the end user and facilities manager of any given building in Victoria. And so that VBIS system you could strike the V off it, and essentially it would be equally applicable to a building in America as it would be in Europe. So full credit to those guys.
That's some interesting work. So it actually could be an exported
very much so.
Outcome.
100%.
Now, we could talk all day because it's a comprehensive document. And the framework covers areas regarding CDEs or common data environments, IP, which is obviously intellectual property, different levels of liability, and it references a detailed asset management accountability framework, which obviously could have us chatting for hours and hours and hours on end. Now, obviously, we've been going on for quite a while now, but are there any other areas or points that you'd like to raise regarding the strategy that we haven't covered before we close up?
Yeah, so IP and legals is an interesting conversation and generally the elephant in a room with respect to BIM. It's important to note with BIM and DE that nothing changes. And that's a profound thing to say, but nothing really does change. The way that we generate information is kind of the same. The way that we should treat information and the ownership and the liability of such should remain the same. And so what VDAS is trying to do with respect to both those topics is to bring that conversation earlier. So before contract award, have those conversations, give ourselves confidence that industry have had those conversations. So if a particular designer or architect wants to retain ownership over a particular design, then that's okay. But that conversation needs to happen much earlier and should form part of the VDAS suite of documents rather than unravelling halfway through execution and not being a benefit to anyone and then unravelling the outcomes of the project itself. It's important to note that VDAS is doing quite a lot of work on understanding the legal and commercial and IP nuances around the BIM use and commercial use of BIM and DE. And that will be fully integrated in the VDAS guidance itself. So if there is an issue that traditionally arises with the use of BIM and DE in implementation, by way of example, then the lessons learned and the recommendations that fall out of that in the earlier phases of the life cycle will be integrated within VDAS guidance. So we have a high degree of confidence that we've captured a lot of that feedback from industry and integrated as best as we can in the VDAS guidance itself.
No, well, thanks very much, Tim. That's lots of good information there that hopefully industry down here in Victoria can take on board and gain an extra level of confidence. But, mate, thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us today about the Victorian Government's VDAS strategic framework. Now, at the moment, I guess you're speaking in your role on behalf of government. But I'm going to take a step back and ask you a personal question. And this is the one question I ask everyone that's on my show as one of my guests. But what does BIM mean to you?
BIM to me is a campfire that we all need. It's something that we all need to huddle around. It's something that we all need to use ideally as a source of truth. And it's something that we all need to drive innovation in our sector. And I think we all owe it to ourselves and our future to step up and apply innovative processes that can benefit the end user. And I really want to stress that. The end user is a future Victorian. It's our kids, it's our brother's son, it's everyone, it's our family. How they interact with that scope is largely at our hands right now. And I see the processes that BIM and 19650 employ as very beneficial to the way that scope in an efficient and effective manner is defined, developed, constructed, operated and maintained for the next 100 years.
It's always great talking to people working in government and seeing how much vision they have for the future. And I think that's one of the things that I find the most joyful thing about having these chats with the likes of yourself and Andrew Curthwaite up in Queensland. But Tim, mate, I'm very grateful for you sitting down and spending the time to talk to me today. I understand how valuable your time is, and I'm very grateful that you've been able to sit down with me to have this conversation so we can share it with the broader audience that may not be able to have attended some of the events that you've may have presented on in the past or heading into the future. But for more information on the Victorian Digital Asset Strategy, please head to our website and find a link to their website for further reading. I look forward to sharing our next podcast in a fortnight's time. Until then, good luck with your digital transition.
For more information, or if you'd like to continue the discussion in the comments section, head over to our website, thedigitaltransition.com. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on our future podcasts. The Digital Transition.